This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and joining me today is a Trek novelist extraordinaire. It's Dr. Una McCormack. Hi, Una, or do you prefer to go by number one these days?
Yeah, well, I was quite pleased with extraordinaire, actually. I quite like that. Yes, I do like going as number one these days, and always have done. Yes, that was quite exciting.
Did you know that was coming? Because I know you'd had some of the scripts for the Tilly novel you were writing earlier in the season, but that was right towards the end. I think it was maybe in the final episode, wasn't it? Was that something that you knew was coming down the line, or was that as much of a surprise to you as maybe it was to the viewers at home?
Absolutely didn't know it was coming. I hadn't got a clue. So, yes, it was, oh, hang on a minute, that's me.
That's amazing. That must be quite a thrilling experience. Because I know some fans have found themselves, like their names working their way into some of the Trek novels. Because I know some of the Star Trek novelists, I'm not sure whether this is something that you've ever done, but some of them I know they'll work in the names of fans that they've been interacting with on social media or whatever. But actually having your name pop up on screen and knowing that there's that kind of link there and there's that kind of rationale behind it. That's sort of something else. That's the next level.
I think it had been put in the novels originally. So certainly David Mack, I think, had called number one Una, and then it was picked up from that. And I know I've done it. I've done it with mates, and I know Jim Swallow has done it with friends. Does it with me? In fact, I think there's a Captain McCormack somewhere in one of his books. And it's very common to kind of do I know lots of people do this, or auction off a bit parts, or it's a charity auction or something.
Yeah.
So it happens quite a lot, but. Yeah, to get on screen, because we all say, with Doctor Who we go, there's no such thing as canon, but yeah, if there was a McCormack suddenly in Doctor Who, it'd be like, this is canonical. So absolutely thrilling. Yeah, I was chuffed to bits, and a really cool character as well. Fantastic
character. I mean, an iconic character, and one that's been there from the very start.
Exactly.
Basically.
Yeah. There's me inscribed right into the start of Trek history. So the women have always been there. Yeah.
You're there for good now. You're right. It's going back in time and changing the past, and like you say, it's part of canon now. And it's interesting that you should bring up Doctor Who, because coincidentally, that is the topic that we're here to talk about today. Una and I met last October, I guess it was, at the Star Trek convention in Birmingham, and we were talking about what we might like to talk about. And then I think it was I was on my way home. I must have been staying later than you that final evening. And I noticed, because I missed seeing it, but the new Doctor Who episode about Rosa Parks was airing, and I saw that you were tweeting about it, and everyone was tweeting about it, because it was probably the first sort of great episode maybe of that latest iteration of Doctor Who, or certainly the first one that kind of seemed to be getting that kind of response online. And that's what suddenly made me think, I know what we should talk about. Because I knew you'd written Star Trek novels, obviously, and I knew you'd written Doctor Who novels as well. And I thought, well, this is clearly the perfect person to come and talk about the kind of links between these two franchises. Because not only do they have in common this sort of I suppose, sort of basic liberal, kind of positive, forward-thinking kind of outlook. They're both sort of social justice warrior shows, one way or another, we might say. But they, of course, also spring, both of them, out of pretty much exactly the same time. I mean, Doctor Who was 63, I think Star Trek was 66. So they're both really coming out of that kind of mid-60s period, but obviously on opposite sides of the Atlantic. So from different cultures, but the same kind of global experience in a sense, and they've both lasted. I mean, unlike pretty much every other show, they're the two that have really stood the test of time. So I suppose they do have a lot in common, but at the same time there are many things that are very different about them, and you must be familiar with that, you know, having worked in both those universes as a writer. The things that are unique to Trek or unique to Doctor Who, that you know, what are the kind of parallels and what are the differences when you're playing in those different sandboxes?
Well, I think certainly the roots of them in the 60s are really, really interesting, because you've got although they're pretty much simultaneous, Doctor Who's a little bit older, a few years older. They're coming out of two different traditions of science fiction. It's obviously Doctor Who has got owes a lot to H.G. Wells, to things like the Time Machine, the Edwardian aspects of what he's sort of wearing. He's a kind of gentleman, amateur explorer. You can see it's coming from this British tradition of science fiction, whereas Star Trek it's brash, it's bold, it's the government in space. It's all about American. It's that kind of confidence, post-war confidence in American culture. Can do this. We can win wars. We can explore. We can put a man on the moon. Though, of course, he's not on the moon when Star Trek starts, of course. So, although they're very close to each other in time, they're coming from these two quite separate traditions. And I think one is obviously a nation that's at its peak. The United States in the 50s and 60s, and the other is a little bit more post-imperial. Suez has happened, a little bit more cynical perhaps about what authority has to say. You know, the Doctor is patrician, but he's always speaking for the underdog. He's mistrustful of big government. He doesn't like it. He pushes against it. So there's always these slightly different flavours, I think. And of course, one's made in black and white. We chucked half of it away. That's very British again. And the other is in, glorious colour, and all of it still exists. So lots of parallels, but lots of differences as well. It's notable, I think, particularly, everybody in Star Trek is in uniform. They're responding to a chain of command and all of these sorts of things. Not in Doctor Who. Not even when Pertwee's part of UNIT, I think, do we get that. And quite the opposite, in fact. We get him railing against bureaucracy, against government, against authority. So similar but different.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting to think about the Doctor as sort of coming out of that time frame. I mean, he is very much, although he always travels with a companion or two, he is very much sort of, he's an outcast, I suppose, isn't he? He's a sort of societal outcast in terms of his own people. He's not kind of someone who likes to play by the rules. He probably, I've seen memes of, David Tennant's Doctor in a Starfleet captain's uniform. He's probably not someone who's going to get on very well with that kind of authority structure and that hierarchy and so on. Although they did do, I think, a few years ago, a crossover comic, didn't they? I think with Matt Smith's Doctor and the crew of the Enterprise under Captain Picard. And they were kind of teaming up to fight a sort of combined effort from the Borg and the Cybermen joining forces.
I think when it comes to totalitarian threats, even the centrists and the radicals can get together, I think.
Yeah.
Or you'd like to hope so anyway, or not, as the case may be. But I think if we're confronted with the Dalek army, we know which side we need to be on, and it's broadly Starfleet and the anarchists.
Well, let's hope so. Absolutely. I mean, there are interesting kind of parallels. The Cybermen and the Borg, obviously. There's an obvious one. These two quite similar. These like big foes that are this kind of cybernetic. I mean, the Cybermen are people inside, so they are very similar to the Borg.
Completely. Yes, sense. I think they're. I think the Cybermen are one of the earliest examples of that. I mean, obviously we'd had robots, and obviously there have been mechanical men and this kind of thing. But this idea of a sort of augmented human it's only sort of coming out in the 60s, isn't it? I think you get the Cybernauts on the Avengers or something, but the Cybermen are really something quite and they're just guys with a metal face that are kind of hitting things. But the Cybermen are they're much those first Cybermen in 10th Planet are absolutely terrifying, even when you look at them through the grainy snow and this kind of thing. And it was an interesting thing the show did to kind of go back to that and see that. Those episodes, those last Capaldi episodes, are quite terrifying. They're really, really horrific. They get the body horror of it. And the Borg, again, I think when you see that done to Picard, that's the real horror in Star Trek, isn't it? That you get this man who is the most humane man, the most humanist of men, the man who celebrates compassion, mercy, individualism, diversity. To see even that overthrown is horrific, and then to see him sort of struggle back from it, I think, as well. So lots in common between those. The Borg and the Cybermen are sort of exactly the same thing. Yeah.
They've got that sort of element in common of almost a kind of existential crisis that goes along with the kind of, like you say, the body horror and so on, in that there's always this sort of question, can someone be pulled back? And obviously in Star Trek, with Picard, we did see him being pulled back, although we saw the kind of trauma that entailed. I guess with 7 of 9, we saw that in a big way. And I think arguably, by the time you get to later Voyager, it sort of seems a bit too easy to pull people back, because there's that episode where Janeway and Tuvok, I think some of her crew anyway, sort of get themselves assimilated and then de-assimilated. It's maybe slightly kind of trivializes that line in some ways. I can't remember whether in Doctor Who, has there ever been someone who came back from being a Cyberman? I know that the what's his name? It shows you I'm more of a Trekkie than a Doctor Who fan. Lethbridge Stewart. That's the one I was looking for. The Brigadier. I was going through ranks in my head thinking Colonel, General. No, it's not that. What is this kind of? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Subaltern. I don't know. No, the Brigadier. Yes, the Brigadier ends up as spoilers, by the way, ends up as a Cyberman, but is a kind of good Cyberman, and his kind of essential goodness carries through. But I don't think he ever manages to come back to being who he was. And with Bill, I think that was similarly an element of her story. It felt like, was she going to be brought back to being herself? But she never quite was. She sort of ended up being rescued in this rather strange way where her consciousness was kind of salvaged in some way. But physically, it seemed like it was a one-way process.
And that's a kind of familiar trope, I think, in Stephen Moffat stories, isn't it? I think one of the big differences between Russell T Davies stories and Stephen Moffat stories is that in Russell T Davies stories, death is death, lads. Okay, that's it. Undiscovered country from which no man returns, or whatever it is. But whereas you always see this attempt to kind of dodge death or come back from death in Stephen Moffat, whether it's uploading somebody to the library or again, downloading Bill's consciousness into whatever the fudge is. But the only
Clara living in that sort of half second or whatever it is between heartbeats.
Exactly that. There's a sort of hesitation over death. I think Amy and Rory dodge death as well, don't they? There's a character that does sort of resist cyberizing, and that's Yvonne Hartman. I did my duty for Queen and Country. I did my duty for Queen and Country. She's the person heading up Torchwood in the Russell T Davies series, and she ends up cyberized. But something of her resists and keeps on fighting against it. It's a very memorable moment. You realise that this faceless, the silver face is the still personhood behind it. Right. And it's although she's been a nationalist and a royalist and has made terrible decisions that have led to this, the core of what was decent is this sort of insistence on a set of values, and that gives her courage and fearlessness, and she fights still to protect, and that sort of core of identity is still there, even though the body has been colonized and destroyed and obliterated. So you're exactly right, a kind of existential threat to values and to selfhood, to this idea of a sort of coherent self, I guess. And to see it with somebody like Picard, who so sorted. To see that kind of broken down is extremely affecting, I think.
Well, it's interesting thinking about that. I mean, on the face of it, you might say that Doctor Who is, I mean, it's a show that is sort of explicitly aimed at children, although obviously a lot of adults watch it as well, compared to Star Trek, which I suppose is aimed at adults, but a lot of children watch it as well, maybe. It feels like it's lighter. It relies a lot more on comedy and humour and kind of incongruity and so on. But in some ways, I think it goes a lot bleaker than Star Trek often does. And actually, these characters who end up trapped in these kind of horrific sort of futuristic technologies one way or another. I mean, there's also, I think, the first time that Clara is introduced in, I mean, I'm talking conspicuously more about new Doctor Who, because I have to say my experience with Doctor Who, I got into it really with the revival series, and I have gone back and watched, a handful of the classic episodes to try and sort of plug those gaps, but there's so much there that I've only really dipped my toe in those waters. So it may be that as much as I'm sort of looking at, how has Doctor Who influenced Star Trek over the years, and the Borg being influenced by the Cybermen, which I imagine there must have at least been some awareness of that, would be one example. But it struck me a lot thinking back over the Doctor Who that I've watched, which started in mid-2000s, how much Star Trek has influenced a lot of those storylines, whether it's for example, there's an episode in the Christopher Eccleston series where Rose goes back to try and save her father from being hit by a car. Feels very much like a sort of riff on City at the Edge of Forever. Even if it's something like the way that David Tennant's Doctor, sorry, this is spoilers again, for anyone who hasn't watched Doctor Who, maybe stop listening
Too
right
late now.
Because I'm just going to ruin it all. David Tennant's Doctor dies in quite a similar way to Spock. He's kind of trapped in a plastic box being irradiated. There's lots of these kind of things that you sort of think, I wonder whether, when they were writing that, was that kind of in their minds. And I suppose these shows, they've both survived for 50 odd years, but they've also kind of both had kind of busy periods and fallow periods.
Absolutely, yeah. They seem to be in a yin and yang as well. That when Doctor Who is on, Star Trek isn't so much, and they seem to sort of be. It's quite good. It means I'm not constantly trying to consume so much of the. We've got both on at the moment, but so yeah, I think. I certainly the impact, but we can't underestimate the impact of Next Generation. When it comes on, I don't know how old you are, but I'm very old, and I remember that, and I remember that there'd been pretty much no science fiction on television for ages in Britain. Blake Seven had been off for ages. Doctor Who was there. We'd had Star Cops, but it had this terrible sort of scheduling, and very few people watched it. And there was a kind of snobbery in Britain, in British TV drama, towards what we at the time we called telefantasy, something speculative. And Next Gen arriving was this sort of wow, this looks incredible. I know when we look at sort of first season Next Gen now, what we're going is, wow, this is really slow and stagey. But in fact, it was incredible. It was absolutely game changing, and the impact on that on what was acceptable to tell on television. And from Next Gen we get the whole kind of spin-off series. From that we get Babylon 5. From Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine we get serialization back in television, and then we're all ready to kind of kick off into things like the X-Files and Buffy and these kinds of things. So that impact of Next Gen on the kind of people who love TV drama and love science fiction, telefantasy is immense. So I'm sure its influence must be present, even if it's in a sort of setting the identity of Doctor Who against Star Trek. Yeah, no, Star Trek is the American show. The British show is a bit more downbeat, a bit more cynical. The kinds of things you wouldn't see on Star Trek are the kinds of things we might do on Doctor Who. So certainly they're in this sort of they're in this dance, aren't they, together? I think so.
Absolutely, and it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about the way those things lined up before, but I suppose you're right. If you think of like Next Gen, certainly through DS9 and Voyager, you had those periods where there were two shows on the air, this sort of spin-off era, and then you had that again with Doctor Who a bit later, didn't you? Because there was Torchwood, there was the Sarah Jane series, there was that series, was it called Class? I didn't see that one, but it was set in the school. There was a period of a lot of spin-offs from Doctor Who. And now it sort of feels like it's kind of contracted down a little bit again. And we do have new Doctor Who being produced with Jodie Whittaker, but they did one season and then there's quite a big gap before the next season, I think. Whereas with Star Trek, we've got Discovery, but we've also got like 4 or 5 other shows in development. And it feels like any minute we're going to be sort of saturated with new Trek because there's so much of it being developed.
Just as Doctor Who quietens down again, I'm sure it's just coincidence, but it is interesting to see this happen. So they're in this. In terms of production, I think they're in this sort of. They're not close. They're obviously being made, an ocean apart and a continent apart. And I don't know how much Doctor Who gets watched in the States. Probably not very much in the 70s and 80s. So an influence on Trek, probably not so much. But it would be hard to be making a science fiction show in Britain and not to have seen or have watched or be influenced in some way by Star Trek. It's just there, isn't it? It's the global science fiction phenomenon.
Well, I wonder whether increasingly, though, we might see more influence going the other way, because funnily enough, my very first exposure to Doctor Who, actually, this isn't quite true. I remember watching that 3D one that they did for Children in Need, but I was slightly baffled by that. I don't think the plot of that necessarily made a huge amount of sense. It all seemed to be about the 3D specs. But the first time I sat down to actually watch Doctor Who, and it's a miracle I carried on watching it, to be honest, was the Paul McGann TV movie, which I know, is controversial on many levels, including on kind of canonical levels, because there are big revelations in there that don't seem to match up with any of the rest of Doctor Who, as I understand it. But I mean, that was self-consciously an attempt to sort of reboot Doctor Who for an American audience, which I don't think was necessarily successful for whatever reason, because it didn't seem to lead to anything. But then I think once you got to the Matt Smith years, certainly they were again trying to kind of hook the Americans. They did start showing it on BBC America, I think, and they did start pulling in American fans.
It has a sort of on its own terms, yeah. I have a soft spot for the TV movie with the Pertwee logo, as we called it, but you can see if you look at it and then you watch Rose, you can see that Russell T Davies has gone, and these are the mistakes I won't make. I won't talk about Gallifrey. I won't talk about backstory. I won't bring it. I'll go back to what happened in that very first episode. Bring back the mystery. All you need is the Doctor and the TARDIS and somebody going on an adventure, and that's all that it needs. And that's exactly what they do. Because he was making a show for people who had probably weren't alive when the McGann story was on. And the problem with the McGann stories, which I quite enjoy, and it looks nice and glossy, and I love Paul McGann, I think he's gorgeous, is that it's immediately immersed in a backstory that in fact people aren't invested in. It might be something that fans want to see on screen, but it's not something that a casual Gallifrey, Daleks, what's this, Skuro, it makes no sense. So it's very canny what Russell T Davies does. But yeah, it's an interesting one to start with. A friend of mine, Hayden Gribble, has written a very nice memoir about growing up as a Doctor Who fan when there's no Doctor Who on screen. So it's a Child Out of Time or something like that, Hayden Gribble, and it's a lovely book, sort of memoir of, because when I was a kid, Doctor Who was on every Saturday night, it felt like, but this is through the wilderness years, and how you become a fan of something that isn't there, I guess. So
that maybe that's why I never quite latched onto Doctor Who, because it might just be a quirk of, I was born in 1983, so I think there was some Doctor Who still, Sylvester McCoy was probably, I could have been watching that, and for whatever reason I wasn't, but then there was this kind of big gap, and I only really started watching, I properly started watching it, I suppose, with Rose, with the Eccleston era, and that was while I was at university. So I was watching it really I've always watched it as an adult, as much as I sort of enjoy it on a kind of, not a childish level exactly, but it is, it does have a lot of charms like that are part of its appeal, I think. But it's interesting that you bring up Rose, because the other thing that's striking, I think, about that episode is the fact, for a start, the fact that it's called Rose, it's named after the companion, it's not named after the Doctor. And I suppose that's what Russell T Davies does brilliantly, I think. And one of the things that really marks his era of Doctor Who, from my perspective, is he writes fantastic like real people, real characters. And, we saw this recently with his series Years and Years. He is just a master writer of kind of interesting, ordinary people.
Yeah, people sitting around having a bit of a bicker around a packet of Revels or something. He's very, very good at that. And that's very, very clever. I mean, it's there in the very first episode. I mean, Rose is focalised through Rose. Mm-hmm. She's the point of view character. But that's right back there in 1963. In An Unearthly Child, it's vocalised through Ian and Barbara. And as far as you'd be concerned as a viewer, if you watched An Unearthly Child fresh, if you sat down in 1963, they would be the leads. You'd be going, these two young teachers have found themselves, and the Doctor's quite an unpleasant, abrasive character. You're really uncertain about him. He's doing rotten things to them, and those are the people that the story is focalised. And Russell T Davies, he's pretty much said this. He looked back at that and he went, "That's how you tell this story. You tell it through the eyes of somebody really very ordinary." And he's fantastic. I remember at the time people when it came up that Rose was Billy Piper was leaving, people who had come to the show just with that, I'd never seen any of the early stuff, were saying, well, how can it survive? This is the setup is the Doctor, the TARDIS, and Rose. That's what the setup is. And we were kind of going, trust us. It's all right. This show's got a lot of legs in it, but she felt absolutely, for new viewers and for many who had, because it brought in a kind of young female audience as well, she was absolutely the point of identification in the show. And people didn't think, new viewers didn't think it could survive the loss of her. Of course it does, because it's Doctor Who and it's the best, most flexible format in television. But there was a lot of sense that it wouldn't survive that. But it's absolutely great, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He's great on that kind of very ordinary person, finding the extraordinary within them when faced with the bizarre or the unusual or the strange or the frightening or the challenging. Great stuff.
Exactly, as opposed to the Moffat companions feel to me more like they're almost these kind of mythic characters in their own right, if you know what I mean. You've got someone like Clara, they seem to have a destiny, they seem to have a kind of, and I know you get that to some extent, I suppose, with Donna in the Russell T Davies era, but you do also get this sense of her as quite a real ordinary sort of person. I mean, when I say ordinary, I don't mean that they're humdrum or they're kind of boring. I mean, what he does is finds the vibrancy in real people's lives.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, Donna is someone you genuinely. I mean, she's obviously they play her a tiny bit over the top and they write her just a tiny bit grotesque. But she's somebody that you would meet. You absolutely believe it. I often think that they're sort of Moffat characters are often they're much more stylized, I think. Which is fun. It's in its own way. They're more like characters from the Avengers. There's something a little bit, like you say, archetypal or stylized, or a bit more like something you'd find in a Marvel movie, perhaps. That it's not somebody that you would be sitting next to on the bus and going, oh gosh, she's putting her lipstick on now, and I've just got a blast of that perfume in my face. It's that's the kind of person that Russell T Davies deals with. People that you would be sitting next to on the bus, and then an alien lands on your head and everybody screams, and she turns out to be the most courageous person you've ever met. Whereas in a Moffat script, they feel much more like they have slightly. There's something a bit more superhero-ish about them. I'm thinking of the Paternoster Gang and that set. Yeah. There's something special about them.
It's interesting. Well, and of course, Star Trek, I suppose, has toyed with these kind of companion-like characters. I mean, I'm thinking, say, Gillian Taylor in Star Trek 4, Rain Robinson in Voyager, who was a character I loved. I thought Sarah Silverman was fantastic in that role. And they were considering, I think, the idea of bringing her on board and making her a series regular, which would very much have been basically filling that kind of companion role. Someone who's not only not a member of Starfleet, but is not even of that century, someone who is completely the fish out of water and can give you that kind of, that sort of counterpoint, can give you that kind of alternative voice in a way. Because I suppose often, what you get with the Doctor and the companion, well, on a kind of very basic sort of formulaic level, the companion bridges the gap between the Doctor and the audience because the Doctor has to explain everything to them. But ideally, it sort of cuts both ways, and the companion is sort of teaching the Doctor something at the same time. Because I suppose if it's all one way, the danger is, especially when it's some 20-year-old girl following him around the whole time, that it does seem like this rather kind of old-fashioned a kind of model of this kind of older guy just mansplaining the whole time, effectively.
That guy leaning over to the woman on the train. Yeah, it's a little bit like that. I'm really thinking through how that would work in Star Trek about maybe having someone from our time, because there's sort of two different modes going on, isn't there? I think there are names that you can attach to different kinds of fantasy. There's an idea of a portal fantasy, which is, you step through a door and then you go into a fantastic space, and that door can be the wardrobe, the rabbit hole, it can be the TARDIS. So that's largely what's happening, and you need somebody taken from an ordinary place into another. So in Lord of the Rings, even Frodo sort of goes through the Old Forest. That's a kind of portal. But in Star Trek, you've got a different sort of fantastical setting. You've got, I think it's known as an immersive setting, is that you're always within, you're straight away within the parameters of this world, and everything operates within that. So you might get, aliens and things that people don't know about, but the world is sort of self-contained. There's no kind of shift from our world to it. So that would be a real kind of breaking of the rules of something, or the instinctive rules of the game of something like Star Trek. It'd be really interesting to see that work. That kind of relationship where the sort of the Holmes-Watson explaining to each other is usually done through a character like Spock or Data in Star Trek. Explain to me this technobabble. I shall explain to you the technobabble. Explain to me the workings of the human heart. I shall explain to you the workings of the human heart. So you've always got that kind of dynamic going on, and that's the similar thing. I think the similar sort of explaining the logic of the story and the emotion of the story to each other. That's what the Doctor and the companion do to each other. It's Spock and Kirk, or Picard and Data, I think. So that's the similar relationship going on, but never someone from our time. I'd love to think about how that would work, because, like I say, it would sort of change the rules of the stories quite a lot. How interesting.
Well, there you go. That's something. Yeah, I mean, you're the one who can run with it. I mean,
she'll go away and have a little think about that.
Yeah. But there is that sort of interesting idea of kind of culture clash, and I know what you mean, that it sort of would break the rules of Star Trek. But on the other hand, Star Trek breaks its own rules with abandon in some ways, and you do get those episodes, particularly, I mean, Future's End obviously is kind of a riff on Star Trek 4 in some ways. It's almost the same scenario and the same beats being played out, but that idea of this kind of culture clash, this idea of someone who kind of almost undercuts the kind of pomposity of that sort of Starfleet idealism, in a sense. I suppose you get it in different ways. You could say, I mean, Quark is not exactly that character, but it's someone who's kind of coming from a different angle and kind of having an interaction with those characters from outside.
Well, the whole of Deep Space Nine is a series of a kind of Greek chorus of characters going. It's like the in the Asterix books, where you've got these Romans, they're crazy. It's like Quark and Garrick and Odo and Descartes and Damar and Weyoun. These Starfleet officers, they're crazy. So Deep Space Nine is like everybody's voice is going, no, it doesn't work like that. And Starfleet are going, no, we shall show you the error of your ways and your thinking. And that's one of the tensions at the heart of Deep Space Nine, I think. Will Starfleet go native, as it were, or will they turn everyone into sort of Starfleet clones? Will they Borgify them? So and that's a central dilemma in Deep Space Nine, certainly.
I suppose it's something you do see. I mean, Doctor Who obviously is like fundamentally a time travel show as much as a kind of sci-fi, as much as it goes in space and time. It does both. And it often, certainly in the later series, it flits between, there seems to be sort of three, like a formula in three. So you have one set on Earth in the present day, you have one set out in space somewhere distant, and then you have one set on Earth in the past. And you kind of, rinse and repeat almost those different permutations of what the show can do. I mean, Star Trek obviously is not fundamentally a time travel show, but it does do time travel stories. And when it does those stories, a lot of it is often about that kind of culture clash between the kind of advanced, enlightened 23rd, 24th century Starfleet people and the kind of more like the real people, whether it's our own time, which Star Trek does do occasionally, but even when it's not our time, when it's kind of close enough. So someone like Zefram Cochrane, okay, that's in a projected sci-fi future, sort of dystopian future, but he is recognisably a character of the 20th century, even if he's technically in the mid 21st century. And, you get this kind of clash. And I suppose both shows, I think they also do interesting stuff with real historical figures. And I mean, I mentioned the idea for this conversation sort of came out of that episode about Rosa Parks. I remember also one of my favourite of the Matt Smith episodes was the episode with Van Gogh, where they go back and meet him. And obviously, Star Trek, we've had Amelia Earhart bumping into Janeway in the Delta Quadrant. We've had we've had Mark Twain, for example. We've had these kind of real life characters having these interactions. Both shows, I think, get a lot of pleasure and fascination in playing that card. And in Doctor Who, there's also the element of actually going back to Sherlock Holmes. I think it's a trick that Conan Doyle sort of invented, because there's a sort of myth about the Great Rat of Sumatra, isn't there? All these kind of cases that you never see. This idea of like seeding all these kind of
which you do see the Rat of Sumatra in Doctor Who. There's a
oh, do you? Right, okay.
Yeah. There's a 70s. The Tans of Weng Chiang is a Holmes influenced story, and
well, that's what I was thinking of. Yes, exactly. And you have a giant rat in there, exactly. And I mean, that's an episode that sort of pretty much explicitly acknowledges that influence, because you've got you've got Sherlock Holmes. You've literally got the Doctor dressed as Sherlock Holmes and saying elementary and doing all this kind of, without ever actually name dropping Sherlock Holmes, basically kind of doing a Sherlock Holmes episode. But so I suppose both shows can kind of draw on that, but you also get with the Doctor, and you get it even in that episode, he makes some reference to, I can't remember what it, when I was chatting to Plato or something. And in the Vincent van Gogh episode, you've got him saying, oh, I remember when, I was there when the Sistine Chapel was being painted, or do you know what I mean? You get all these references to these sort of imagined escapades that are never going to be seen on screen as a way of sort of bolstering the mythology of these characters, almost like throwing little bones to the audience.
Either the
somehow.
Doctor is just a massive name dropper, or he's just the greatest teller of fibs. But I mean, it's Towns of Wen Chiang is written by Bob Holmes, and I know I know it's quite problematic in many ways, that story. I think what Robert Holmes is very good at is the throwaway line of dialogue that creates an entire world in your mind. The classic one is, I was there as the Filipino army advanced on Reykjavik, which is just a genius piece of writing, entire piece of history called up in that. It's also beautiful to say, so the actual line is pleasurable and clever. So just on a kind of the pleasure of saying the line, it's enjoyable. But then this whole world is conjured up in your mind. And yes, television and a television that's being made on a budget has to do that. Doctor Who has historically not had a large amount spent on it. And so lines like that are extremely effective. So to be able to conjure up these archetypes in your mind of historical figures, you've immediately got this sort of you can tap into that whole vein of stuff that people already know. You can activate that in their imaginations. I think the historical figures are there originally because it's meant to be an educational show. The two teachers at the start are a science teacher and a history teacher. The idea is that there would be a sciencey week and then a historical week, and then a science fiction week and a historical week, and it doesn't quite pan out like that at all. But the historicals are there to sort of they're quite serious. They're not what you'd immediately think of, those very early 60s. We get something with the Aztecs, or we get something during Revolutionary France, or you get something about the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, or this kind of thing. It's like, whoa, where did that one come from? It's this bizarre bit of French history, or so they're there to have a kind of educational purpose. I think in the contemporary show, up until recently, they've had more of a sense of historical tourism. Rocking up and meeting Vincent van Gogh, and it's all very beautiful, and you're looking at all those images, or nipping back to meet Charles Dickens because it's really exciting. And they play with this when they meet Victoria, and they're kind of nudging each other, and they're just giggling over it and trying to get her to say she's not amused. They're sort of playing with that. But in this season, I think the historicals have been incredibly interesting, and they've got, first of all, they've gone back to the kind of educational remit, and I know there's people going, oh, it makes it sort of all preachy and teachy or whatever. So the Rosa Parks one, and I think the Demons of the Punjab, they are genuinely what I would call a sort of post-imperial or post-colonial stories. They pull the Doctor away and his companions away from having the role of saviour, and they're extremely carefully and well thought through. Rosa they step back to allow Rosa the stage, the ability to act. And when you get to the Punjab episode, Demons of the Punjab, the aliens are practically they're almost a red herring in a way. They're simply there to witness. They're not a threat. They've not been the trigger for what's going on. You could take them out of that story and you wouldn't miss it. They're almost to sort of to deflect you in a way. And the story is about the actual history that's unfolding. And these are really interesting shifts in what Doctor Who is doing in its storytelling. I'll be very interested to see if they do a pure historical next season. It's a big change. And meanwhile, on Star Trek, I guess what you're doing with historicals, I'm thinking of things like Past Tense and Deep Space Nine. You're treating them as warnings from history, aren't you? You're sort of sending back the evolved humans or the supermen of Starfleet to go back and look at a period of our history and say, well, this is where we came from. Thank goodness we're not there anymore. And most memorably, Far Beyond the Stars, I guess. And then they do a Roswell episode where it's absolutely daft. But most of the fun of it is just from seeing how much people are smoking. So in Trek, I guess it's much more a sort of social commentary on what's in the world that we're in, I think. Yeah.
Although I would say, strikingly in Star Trek, I mean, Past Tense, a bit like First Contact, I suppose, the movie, is yes, they're going back in time, but they're going back in time into what is still a sci-fi, not very sci-fi, but is still a kind of, again, a sort of dystopian future. I feel like when Star Trek actually goes back into the past, and Far Beyond the Stars is a bit different because it's sort of, is it real, is it a dream, where does it kind of sit? When they actually go into the past, I'd say more often than not, it is for a kind of fairly light romp, if you know what I mean. And maybe they're not necessarily maybe as engaged with these kind of key events. Doctor Who, shall we kill Hitler? What do we do? There's a greater sense in Doctor Who, I suppose, and it's almost an issue for the show, I suppose, that you've got this character who's this great sort of humanitarian, extremely compassionate, very kind, all qualities that he shares or she shares, that the Doctor shares with, with Starfleet characters, with Starfleet captains and so on. But you've also got this tension between that and, again, as in Star Trek, in Star Trek we have the Prime Directive, which is a kind of break on that impulse to some extent. The Doctor clearly has very similar rules. They don't call it the Temporal Prime Directive as they do in Voyager, but he has clear rules about things he's not allowed to do. As much as his role is going around saving people from dying horrific deaths, in certain circumstances, he's not meant to do that. And by the time you got to the end of the David Tennant run, the kind of penultimate story was one where basically he kind of flips towards the end. The whole story is him basically saying, I can't do anything. I can't stop this event from happening. And interestingly, this is not it's not a real historical event. It's not like in Quantum Leap where he thought he was going to stop Kennedy being assassinated. It's a kind of future history event. So the stakes are slightly different for us as the real world viewers. But the whole sort of storyline there really is the Doctor kind of coming to a point where he says at the end, sod it, actually, I'm the only Time Lord left. I don't care about the rules anymore. I'm going to, screw up the whole timeline and do whatever I want. I know best, basically. And then he sort of gets punished for it because it doesn't work. It blows up in his face. And then I'm not saying this is necessarily why he ends up dying in the next episode, but I feel there's almost a kind of sense that like he got too big for his boots. He got kind of, there's something kind of megalomaniacal about it.
Well, all these questions about Prime Directive and interventionism are all sort of, to my mind, they're kind of veiled allegories of imperial and military intervention. So it's an agonising on the screen through the medium of popular culture about America as the world's policeman, or what is Britain's role in as a post-imperial power, and these kinds of things. So I don't think I'm stretching too far. I genuinely don't think I am. But certainly the prime directive is there to sort of police imperialism, I guess, is the idea, isn't it? We, historically intervening in other people's affairs has led to the construction of empires. Empires are bad things. Let us not intervene. Oh God, they're all killing each other. We can't let this. Yeah, so it's a sort of playing out of these anxieties, and what certainly in the 90s, in things like Deep Space Nine, it's what is America meant to be doing as the world's only significant power? Does it have a moral imperative to intervene, or are these interventions kind of bound to end in a worse effect? And then you would kind of go, well, Kosovo, yes. Iraq War, no. Yeah. So they're a sort of playing out of that dilemma, I think. And then in the case of Doctor Who, I think it's sort of there's a lot of that David Tennant story is, I think, working through the anxieties of the Iraq War. So you're kind of seeing that played out on screen. Is it right to sort of, if you have this power, what are the conditions under which it is right and wrong to use it? Is kind of my reading, and whether the show sort of can do that meaningfully or does do it meaningfully, that's another question, I think. Also, I think it's a real problem as a storyteller. If I've had this experience. I wrote a Doctor Who short story set during the Spartacus rebellion, and the problem with setting something in known history is that you know how it ends, and the show itself hits up against this with the Pompeii episode. If you know how things play out, what story can you tell there? Because we know that the Doctor doesn't stop Pompeii from erupting, and all these people are going to die. So we've lost that dramatic element. So where do we find the drama? And the Doctor has to resort to quite a small scale intervention there, doesn't he? He saves Peter Capaldi, in fact. Yes,
there you go, yeah.
All power to him.
Turns out to be a prophetic move, clearly. Yeah.
Saves his own future self. Yeah. So there's a dramatic problem there for a storyteller, I think.
Although you can go the route, I mean, the Quantum Leap route was quite clever, I think, when they did that Kennedy episode, because the way it worked out was that in the universe before Quantum Leap, in a sense, Jackie Kennedy died as well, and that was their kind of twist at the end. So they managed to make it seem that he did manage to influence something, and you were like, oh, okay, right, well, that's what happened. So you kind of it almost slots himself into real world history in that sense. I think the difference, though, also is that yes, you can have this sort of anti-colonial idea and this kind of these ideals and this, directives, whatever. Where it becomes very difficult is when it gets personal. And obviously, we do see it with Kirk in City on the Edge of Forever and so on. I mean, I think that the Eccleston episode where he takes Rose back to the point where her father dies and expects her not to try and save his life it's interesting because it kind of breaks their relationship temporarily, because he's very down on her and very kind of, he turns on her really in that episode. But I think to expect someone not to behave like that is expecting a level of coolness and kind of rationality. I suppose all these things that, Roddenberry, certainly by the time of The Next Generation, would kind of think that humans ought to aspire to, these kind of noble, disinterested sort of sentiments. But realistically, who is not going to do exactly what she did? And in Voyager we see the catastrophic example in Year of Hell of the Anoraks, who is trying to save his own family and is kind of just creating havoc, and it gets worse and worse and worse the more he tries to meddle in it because of how complicated it is. But ultimately, how much can you expect someone to really respect those? I suppose it's a big question. How much, if something is scientifically possible, or is in this sort of fantastical world, so if certain things are possible, certain kinds of interventions, to what extent can you really expect someone to hold back from doing what they can?
Yeah, and part of what's so clever about that episode, Father's Day, is it's setting up the alienness of the Doctor for a new viewer as well. That we're rightly saying, well, who wouldn't do that? Well, somebody who's a Time Lord wouldn't. Yeah, they're playing a longer game. They see life is much more ephemeral to them. there's a longer story going on, or there are things that you don't know about that can have an effect. So it sets up the alienness of him, and it sets up our sympathy to Rose, and a sense that she's moving into a different and quite frightening world where perhaps the rules are changing. It's a lovely episode. It's very, very scary. It's quite sapphire and steelish, that episode, I think. That sort of coldness that you feel as the I forget what the creature's called now, but as it kind of comes down, people sort of disappear and are eaten. There are sort of laws to time. A little bit Stephen King as well, isn't there?
Langoliers.
Yeah, this idea that things are sort of
things that eat up time.
Exactly that, and are sort of setting it right, or a byproduct of something going wrong. So no, it's a very good episode, and it dramatises this new relationship that she's got into with this very powerful, very different, very alien man. He's not just some bloke. There's other stuff happening as well, and there's things that perhaps she doesn't understand. But then at the same time, as you say, who wouldn't do that?
And I suppose that's one of the things that's interesting about the Doctor as a character, is there is this sense of, as much as the actor might be regenerated each time, there is this sense of this character that's hundreds or thousands or God knows how old exactly, this great age. And I suppose you do see that in Star Trek as well. I mean, the closest link probably to the Doctor really in Star Trek is the Trills, and you see exactly the same thing, I suppose, when Terry Farrell leaves DS9. You get the replacement Dax just in the same way as you get the replacement Doctor each time. And I suppose it's interesting, we were talking a little bit earlier about death and kind of the way these shows look at death. I mean, in some ways, Doctor Who, just like with Star Trek, you have these kind of constant red shirt deaths. I mean, the death count in Doctor Who is pretty high. There's always like random people who get blown up or incinerated or vaporized, or I mean, and to the point that there's that one episode where the Doctor in the Eccleston again sort of says, this time no one's going to die. This is kind of the one episode where no one is going to die in this episode. I'm going to keep them all alive right to the end.
That's a Stephen Moffat episode, isn't it? It's right, Doctor exactly, Dances. Yeah, everybody lived.
But then the Doctor himself, of course, is the one who dies but comes back. Who that is baked into the show. So whether or not other characters can kind of do that, the Doctor is sort of the exception. And there is this, probably that's one of the most fundamental, distinctive things about the show. And obviously, it wasn't baked into the concept. I mean, it wasn't originally the intention. This was a way of getting around the fact that the lead actor was not up to it anymore, and a way of recasting. But a brilliant decision in retrospect, because that's one of the things that has allowed the show to keep going, and to change the companions, to change the Doctor, to have this kind of constant recycling in a much more kind of frequent and kind of almost sort of organic way than Star Trek, which has rebranded itself, has rebooted itself, has kind of revisioned itself at various points, even within series to some extent. You get these sort of soft reboots within a series where they bring a new character in, or they like the Defiant, bringing the Defiant into DS9 or something like that. But Doctor Who is like constantly evolving by changing the personnel, moving the pieces around, redesigning the TARDIS, getting a new Doctor, getting a new companion, etc. While at the same time the kind of overall not the overall story, but the overall sort of format is kind of endlessly trundling forward.
Yeah. All you need is a madman in a box, is the that's the line from the show, isn't it? Or a mad woman these days, of course. So all it needs is the Doctor and the TARDIS, and somebody to go. Oh, I wonder what happens if I step inside this ridiculous little box. Oh my God! So that's the format, isn't it? I'll come in, and I'll go for a ride in your ridiculous, tiny box of wonders and delights. So and that's what makes it so clever. So the Doctor is constantly. It's never really a death. It's a sort of they sort of play it that way. It's really interesting. Capaldi's death in particular, I think, was really interesting, and Matt Smith's as well. And it's partly a farewell for the actor, but we're going back to sort of thinking about what personhood means and selfhood means again. You see the death of a person, don't you? And yet the Doctor continues. You see the death of 12 or 10, or I'm not supposed to call them that, am I? I think people get very cross about that, but I'll do it anyway. You see the death of 10 or 11 or 12, and the new Doctor emerging, but it is still the Doctor. It still feels like there's always that agelessness, that playfulness, that sudden anger, that quick thinking, that sort of quick talking as you're trying to think of what you're going to do next. The Doctor remains whilst the person disappears, I think. And yeah, I really love Esri Dax. I think it's a lovely performance by Nicole de Berry. Really, really hard job to take that on at that stage in a show after such a popular performance. And I think she plays it with a sort of it's so cleverly done because Esri's sort of tripping over her feet and her words, and isn't really trained yet, and is completely out of her depth, and never planned to host a symbiont, and all these sorts of things. And then you see this sort of this gaucheness to her, and at the same time you see Dax, this very ancient thing, the wisdom of it or the experience of it suddenly come through, and she'll come out with something that's absolutely on the button. The advice she gives, or the guidance she gives. I sometimes think of Guinan as being from Gallifrey. She's somebody else who seems sort of Time Lordish to me. And then of course we've got Q, who can zip, but he's different. He's the Doctor is not all powerful. He's just very, very clever and very, very sort of quick thinking. But I guess they would be the other figures that I think are most Time Lordish, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I can see that, definitely. I mean, it's interesting, this sort of question of identity and, to what extent is it the same person? Is it a different person? And also, now that you have with Jodie Whittaker, and I know that you've written, both for previous male doctors and now for the new, 13, the new female Doctor. And I think there is this sort of interesting question. I mean, I was very excited when they cast Jodie Whittaker. I think she's a fantastic actress. I think she's great. I think she was a really good choice for it. And I like her a lot. I did feel when I first started watching it, I don't know why, and I don't know if this is maybe it's just sort of ingrained sexism, or maybe it's to do with the writing or whatever, but there was something about it that made me feel, is this the same character? And the thing that seemed different to me, and this may be my limited knowledge of Doctor Who, is most of the Doctor Who's that I'd seen, since Eccleston, there's this real kind of arrogance that is quite there's a sort of a more unpleasant side to their character, maybe less so with Matt Smith, but certainly if you think of Capaldi and Tennant particularly, and Eccleston to some extent. And that was the thing that I felt was slightly missing from the way they characterised Jodie Whittaker. And I was thinking, is that because it's a woman and they don't want to lean on that? Do you know what I mean? Are they pulling away from the kind of more acerbic side of the Doctor's personality? And therefore that makes me question slightly, is this really the same person? I suppose it's an interesting question, when you have, and we had all this in Star Trek, of course, with Janeway, is she too feminine? Is she too masculine? This kind of constant anxiety because it's a woman in that role of everything becomes gendered somehow. And I suppose there's that interesting question with Jodie Whittaker of, is she, I'm not saying she's not just as much the Doctor, like I think it's fantastic that she's the Doctor, but what does being the Doctor mean when it's a woman being the Doctor? I suppose because she's the first one and there hasn't been another female Doctor before, are they almost consciously unconscious of it in some way? They're kind of, it's always in the person's mind writing it. And I'm curious, for you, having written for her Doctor, but also for previous Doctors, do you approach it differently in any way, knowing that you're writing for that version of the character? I mean, it must change depending on which Doctor you're writing, right? Even though on one level it's the same thing.
The way I write the Doctor is that I always try to write the Doctor. So I always write to that essential person. And then, and you can see this, I think this footage of, isn't there footage of Sylvester McCoy delivering one of Tennant's speeches or something? And you go, oh yes, that's the Doctor. But it's the seventh Doctor. It's absolutely consistent. Right. So I always keep that, never cowardly, never cruel. I always keep that in the back of my mind. But then the Doctor performs to a different space. So whatever their physicality is, that Doctor is going to be slightly different. And what makes it what makes it interesting when it's a woman is not so much that the Doctor has changed, but how people treat women, or what they consider as acceptable behaviour from women is different. And that's why the Witchfinders is such a, if there was any of the earlier Doctors in that, it would be a different episode. The fact that the Doctor is female there, in an intensely misogynist situation, alters the nature of the interactions that she is going to have. It's not that the Doctor is different. It's that the people around her treat her differently because she is a woman. So, and they were very, very clever with that. I thought they. I think one of the reasons that maybe the 13th Doctor is more friendly, more sort of personable, is they'd really leaned into the kind of crankiness with the Capaldi Doctor. So there's always going to be that. Well, we're not going to do it quite like that. We're going to swing the other way. So I think it's probably as much to do with it being coming straight after that. But I think they had also quite carefully thought through what it would. They didn't make a big fanfare. They kind of go, "Oh, great, I'm a woman this time, hooray!" There's a little bit of that. But then I think that episode in particular was very, very careful about the way it thought through what it means to have this person presenting as female, and played that through chose a very good setting for it, and played it through extremely well. So props to them. They handled that question in a really, really excellent way, and in an excellent episode. One of the highlights of the season for me, I think, that episode, really good. But I think partly her more personable nature is maybe just a reaction to what came before. Because the Capaldi Doctor is quite horrible sometimes, particularly at the start. It's really, really kind of cranky and not very kind. So I think, and that's not very Doctorish. Being unkind is not terribly Doctorish to me. And I will say one thing about Jodie Whittaker, which is that everyone at my kids' school is nuts about her. So as far as my 5-year-old is concerned, this is the Doctor. In a sort of well, yes, I will watch those other ones, but can we watch the proper one now, the girl one?
So is she excited? I mean, if she knows that you're writing a story, because I've read your most recent what's it called? Molten Earth, is that what it's called?
Molten Heart.
The most recent, yeah. And that is obviously with Jodie Whittaker's 13, and it struck me reading that, and also having read some of your Star Trek novels, it does feel like that certainly that Doctor Who novel is geared maybe towards a younger. I mean, I enjoyed it, but it felt like it could be read at a younger level than some of the Star Trek novels, which might require a slightly higher level.
That's absolutely conscious. I mean, you want an 8-year-old reader to be able to read this book. So as I was reading the Target novelizations when I was a kid. So I was 7, 8, 9. Reading those books. And that's exactly the gap that they're meant to fill. You want a kid to be able to sit down and read this book by themselves, and hopefully be a little bit stretched and have fun and recognise the Doctor, or an adult to pick it up and think, well, I enjoyed that. That was a nice slice of the show. So that's sort of how they're intended to be written. Yeah. But the Star Trek books, I think, have got a very different. Yeah, it's an entirely different audience, and an entirely different thing that you're doing with the show, I think. So yeah, they are very different.
I'm curious. Does your daughter feel like if you're writing for the 13th Doctor, that's like she's more excited about that than if you go back and write something for one of the previous Doctors? There must be that kind of, because everyone has their own Doctor, I suppose. A bit like maybe everyone has their own Star Trek that sort of got them in. Everyone has. I mean, for me, I think actually, when I think of Doctor Who, I think of David Tennant. Maybe just because, although Christopher Eccleston, I saw all that first, it was only one season, it was so short. The David Tennant years are the ones that kind of lodged in my mind. So he's almost the kind of template for me that I think unconsciously comparing other people to. I mean, who was your Doctor? Who was the Doctor when you first started? And does that influence how you see all the others?
Well, the first Doctor I saw was probably Pertwee, and then I must have watched most of Tom Baker. But my Doctor is Peter Davison, which are the stories that I really imprinted on. And then later, I love Sylvester McCoy's stories, and I love Ace and the stories that she has. I think Ace is a transformational companion. You wouldn't have Rose without Ace. So I would say Peter Davison and Sylvester McCoy. And then, of course, I just, watching my little one sort of just love Jodie Whittaker so much. I'll always have a soft spot for that Doctor. I think the only thing that could excite her more was if I wrote a Sarah Jane novel, because Sarah Jane is the one that she absolutely loves. Sarah Jane Adventures, absolutely perfect.
Well, she also was like one of those, real sort of perfect companion characters, I think, as well, wasn't she? She was one where they really kind of, so it seems like the companions, sometimes they hit it, sometimes they don't quite gel for whatever reason. Sometimes that dynamic, whatever it is about them, the character or the dynamic or something really kind of lands.
Oh, she's just great. We showed my little one Hand of Fear the other day, which is Sarah Jane's last story, and she's just great in it. There's a playfulness. She's the doctor's being all sort of important things, and she's sort of going, Doctor, we're doing this all the time. There's a fun to her and a playfulness, and then a kind of vulnerability to her as well. It's a beautiful performance, and she brings that to the Sarah Jane Adventures as well. She was wonderful, quite wonderful. So Sarah Jane Adventures was the gateway in, and then perfectly they cast a woman, and that was it. Deal done.
Right. Yeah. Good plan on the part of the Doctor Who producers there to nab your daughter's viewing interest.
Given we have a full-size Dalek, I think that was going to happen anyway. But you never know. Sometimes they resist.
It could have gone wrong. I know. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, and Sarah Jane, of course, is a character who was sort of brought back in the Tennant era and then given this whole sort of life as a spin-off character in her own right. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about Doctor Who that does connect with Star Trek is when you have these very long-running franchises, both more than half a century at this point and still going strong one way or another, is the kind of role of nostalgia for the show's own past. I mean, we talked a little bit about canon and kind of tying yourself in knots over canon, which Star Trek, particularly with Discovery, say, has raised a lot of issues around canon, and it always does when Star Trek kind of reinvents itself one way or another. But there's also this sense of kind of nostalgia and in-jokes and kind of fan service, and these, say these anniversary episodes, and Doctor Who has it baked into these ideas of, the 5 Doctors, the 3 Doctors, the kind of, this idea that you can bring characters back. And in the Tennant era, they were bringing lots of characters sort of back one way or another, but you can also you can even bring the Doctor back, and you can have these kind of crossover episodes, which is a really Star Trek fans always sort of wanted this when Next Gen and DS9 and Voyager were all on the air. There was always this sort of clamour for we want to see Voyager come back to Deep Space Nine. We want to see more interaction between these shows, and there was never actually all that much, other than a character like Worf who crosses from one into the other. But with Doctor Who, you get this kind of real excitement. I suppose we got it with Trials and Tribulations in Star Trek. It's sort of the closest, almost, the idea of going back into another episode. And Capaldi's final episode sort of does the same thing, because he encounters the first Doctor with it, and their storylines kind of converge somehow. But that idea of not only getting the previous performers back, but almost kind of going back into your own time stream, as it were, and playing with the kind of nostalgia of the audience and the creators as well, in the way you do that. I mean, we saw it in Discovery with going back to Talos 4 and so on, and the whole storyline with Pike and your namesake, of course, and Spock and so on.
Yeah, I think they did it very well in Discovery, didn't they? I think that you didn't need to be invested or remotely know who Pike was. You will almost certainly have a sense of what the Enterprise was, and if you had no interest in Star Trek, you're probably not watching Discovery for one thing. But you could pick up Pike on his own terms. I think it's such a great. He's absolutely great in it, doesn't he? He absolutely owns it. Trials and Tribulations is it's the textbook in how to do this kind of thing. It is just brilliant. The aesthetic that they get. I know that the writers talk about sort of sending, and they use Dax as well, don't they? Because Dax remembers this period in history. And the writers talk about having Dax going around as the sort of, oh, cool, look, that's Spock, oh, cool, that she's the sort of mouthpiece for the excitement about all of this.
She's got genuine nostalgia because she remembers it. That's the thing. Whereas so much of nostalgia is kind of manufactured, but for her, it's authentic.
Oh, yeah, I'm going back into I can't believe these. Oh, I loved this design, and I miss these skirts, and it's kind of thing. Doctor Who stuff is, yeah. well, as we talked about with the McGann movie, that sort of fan service didn't work. It sort of turned off the audience. I think by the time we got to the 50th anniversary with Doctor Who, it's been on screen so long that it's been on about 8 years, hasn't it? Comes back in 2005, the anniversary is 2013. So it's got its own momentum, hasn't it? 8 years of television you can sort of reasonably look back on and reflect on. I think they just about get away with it. I have to say, I was busy having a baby in the middle of all the 50th anniversary celebration stuff. Right, so okay. I've watched that episode many times, and I still have. I've no idea what happened in that episode, no idea what happened when it went out. And then when I watch it, I kind of go back into this sort of oxytocin-filled bliss state. So I kind of still have no idea what happens. I watch it many, many times. I have no idea what's happened. My favourite out of those anniversary episodes is the tiny little web episode with McGann, where they go back and they sort of go to his regeneration into the War Doctor. It's just a tiny little. It's absolutely a little slice of fan service. That phrase. It's taking you back to the Sisterhood of Khan, and he lists all the big Finnish companions and this kind of thing. Right. But you kind of you see this sort of glimpse of what the McGann Doctor could have been. You go, wow! I feel like I've just been delivered 3 seasons of that. I've got all this intensity, and now I can sense what that show would have been like. And of course, it's there on the Big Finish audios. But I love that. So that if they wanted to deliver me a slice of nostalgia and reboot the show at the same time, that does it perfectly. But yeah, I sort of have a mixed sense about those, because I think it's quite tricky to bring characters back, because that it might not be quite what you remembered, or they interpret it in a different way, or you feel like maybe it means the show is running out of steam, but you can't blame them over the 50th anniversary. If you can't do it then, when can you do it? So
they do it with a lot of love, I think, and it is very a bit like Trials and Tribulations. I mean, for me, even as I say, not a huge Doctor Who fan, but someone who'd kind of been watching it since it came back, there were references in that episode that I'm sure I missed, but there were quite a lot of nuggets that did sort of resonate one way or another for me, and others that kind of I feel like sometimes you can sense where something is gesturing to, even if you don't quite know the details of the original sort of reference, if you know what I mean. It seemed to be done with a lot of heart and done with a lot of skill and so on. And you're right, absolutely, that Paul McGann short as a sort of extra little bonus element of the story, absolutely sort of teases the Doctor that could have been. And of course, for you as someone writing tie-in fiction, this is sort of these are rich veins to tap, in a sense. When you have a character like Pike, I mean, up till Discovery, Pike was one of these characters who had been seen on screen extremely briefly, but had made such a big impression, and number one, of course, made such a big impression that people wanted to find out more about these characters, wanted to know what her name was. They wanted to know more about them and to kind of fill in those gaps. And I guess that's one area where the kind of tie-in fiction really comes into its own. I've just been reading. I'm writing an essay about a writer called Vonda N. McIntyre, and she novelised, as well as being a phenomenal science fiction writer in her own right. She novelised the movies 2, 3, and 4, and her novelisation of The Wrath of Khan is one of those books that you mention it and people go, "Oh my God, that book!" It's just it changed my relationship to science fiction. It changed my relationship to Star Trek. So I've been rereading them all. I've just got to Search for Spock. My God, she pulls a good book out of her. Really? And not great script. You're kind of reading them and going, these are far better than they have any right to be. They're terrific, really, really good books. Yeah. You'd be delighted to have read them, because she has the space to what you're doing in a novel is spending time inside someone's mind. So all the moments that you see very quickly, she has the space and the what a novel is meant to do
spend some time in somebody's mind talking about the thought processes and so on. So they really are wonderful. I haven't read the one for the Voyage Home yet, but the first two are just extremely good indeed. Really good books. She was a terrific writer. So yeah, it's those are novelizations, and I think tie-in spin-off gives you a little, obviously it gives you the space to explore that universe a little bit more, play with it a little bit more, extend it, expand it, deepen it, enrichen it. Is enrichen a word? I think so. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you mention Vonda McIntyre as someone who, has written, as Star Trek fans know, lots of Star Trek tie-in fiction, but also written her own science fiction, because I know you've recently sort of branched out, having started off really as working this kind of tie-in stuff. You've recently published a book that was all is all your own universe.
It is,
The Undefeated, which I read on my summer holiday this year and thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved it. The only thing is it's quite short, and I realised I'd run out of stuff to read before I finished my holiday. But no, it's a fantastic book. But I'm curious. What how did you find it different approaching that? Not having, because obviously when you do this tie-in stuff, I imagine. I mean, I know certainly with the Discovery novel, you must have had Kirsten Beyer pinging you emails and telling you what you can and can't do, and there's a lot of kind of you have to fit into someone else's kind of universe and play by the rules, and there must be all these kind of constraints one way or another, whereas presumably when you're constructing your own imagined universe, you can kind of be let free, if you know what I mean.
I find that hard in it, and maybe it's because I started out as my first degree was in history, and then I kind of trained as a sociologist. So I've always been working with other people's stories. If you see what I mean, history is about getting used to a whole load of dates and what people did, and whether it's causes of the First World War or causes of the Dominion War or causes of the Ring War. Sure. You're kind of you're learning about that material and understanding the motivations, and then I guess when you're doing field research in sociology, again you're listening to people's stories and interpreting them, so you're getting to understand their point of view and their perspective and their view of the world. So I've never felt like a blank sheet is helpful or meaningful, that I'm involved in a sort of act of interpretation or responding to material. So I've always been in that mode. So sort of coming up with my own stuff as a blank sheet is incredibly hard work. That's why it's taken me till my 40s. And the trick in my head was to feel like I was responding to a huge text that I was calling science fiction or the Western canon. and I guess I got to a point where I felt I was sort of sufficiently immersed in it that I could start responding to it. Was the trick I had to tell. So I know some people feel like they have to be not influenced, or they have to let their genius reign free, but that's not how I feel. I'm always in response. It's chipping into a conversation in some way.
Well, I think it's interesting. One of the things I loved about The Undefeated is that it's that sense of, and maybe this is where it comes from. In one sense, it's kind of a small story within a much bigger story that you're kind of only vaguely glimpsed. Do you know what I mean? There is a kind of big sort of geopolitical kind of space opera type thing going on, almost in the background, and we're quite focused in. And I think one of the things that certainly all your Star Trek novels that I've read that I loved about them is that they do tend to focus more on, they're not typical kind of action adventure novels, if you know what I mean. We've got the Tilly novel, which is really a sort of coming of age story. The Never-Ending Sacrifice, a great sort of Cardassian novel, which I know lots of people on the Trek Book Club, for example, everyone votes it as their best Star Trek novel they've ever read. And these are novels that are, I mean, in different ways. It's not that you're filling in the gaps in terms of like, okay, well, we don't know for this 6 months what Captain Kirk was doing, so let's make something up. It's more kind of looking at different kinds of stories that you can tell within the Star Trek universe. And sometimes it does seem like it's looking for the slightly smaller stories. I mean, I really enjoyed your book Enigma Tales, which is set on Cardassia, but a lot of the plot is about who's going to get this job at the university. I can imagine where you got some inspiration for that one. But, it's actually really fascinating, really interesting. And it's the sort of thing that is quite detailed. Do you know what I mean? And I think that is a real strength that certainly you bring to the Star Trek novels that I've read, and it's an interesting approach writing your own stuff. I'm curious, if there are going to be more set in the kind of the Undefeated universe.
Oh, I certainly hope so. Yeah, I feel like it's a place that I've been imagining it for a long time. I think this is another. You need to feel confident that you've imagined a place fully, and I've been imagining that space and the possibilities in it for some time now. So certainly I've got several stories that I would love to tell. I've just been working up an outline for one that I would really like to write. So there's lots more. I had a short story a couple of years ago which is set in that got a shortlisting for the BSFA award. Didn't win it, sadly, never mind. But yes, I feel like it's a world that I've sort of been building in my imagination, and so it's something that I would feel confident telling stories about. But yeah, it's nice to. I think with I'm not a very outdoorsy type. I would quite happily spend all week just at home reading a book. So the thought of having to describe a space battle, it's like I can't even drive a car, but so that's not going to happen. What does this button do? This lever? I don't know. Shoot something. I think with a torpedoes. Yeah. I don't know. But watching people gossip at universities and jockey for the deanship, that's much more familiar, and people will be doing that. And then I guess Rugel's story in The Never-Ending Sacrifice is it's a coming of age story as well, I guess, but it's a story about exile and not feeling that you fit in, and you've been forced to go somewhere that you don't want to, and which is I suspect a lot of teenagers or young people feel that way. And then the impact of a war. So I just thought about war stories that I'd read, people I'd talked to, or relatives who'd been through the Second World War, because the Dominion War is the Second World War, what it must have been like to be on the Eastern Front, when the war ends, but there's just chaos. Reading things like War and Peace, and just, that experience of a sort of devastating change to your world, and just thinking about how that must feel. And because I'm a sociologist by inclination, thinking about the sort of broad sweep of history and society and what that experience is like on an individual person, I'm always sort of shifting between those two, I think. And that's in The Undefeated as well, I guess, that sort of broad sweep, and then down onto a single person's experience. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, but it's interesting. I mean, me too, like the focus of all the work that I do, which is, sort of broadly speaking, history, but it's very much focused on ordinary people's experience of history rather than the, quotes, important people. And I suppose that is one way of looking at The Never-Ending Sacrifice, is that it's almost like a sort of minor, not like a minor key, it's a sort of counterpart to one thing I loved about it is that it does sort of fit in between the gaps, and you do get little clues every so often as to what's going on in DS9 that which we all watched 20 odd years ago at the same time. So it does slot very carefully into different moments, if you know what I mean. But it's always looking at a different angle on it. I built up a sort of spreadsheet and a chronology while I was writing, going, I know that this happens, and let's watch that episode. Oh, there's a throwaway line about the water supply not being very good. I can get a chapter and a half out of that. Because what would that involve? Your water supply isn't working. Does it mean there's outbreaks of cholera? Does it mean that how are they distributing it? Is it rich people getting more? Is it getting to the villages? Is it what would Cardassians do if there wasn't enough water? You genuinely can get one throwaway line if you just ask about how the Filipino army advanced on Reykjavik. Then you've got to tell this whole story behind it. So you've got to kind of tease all that out one way or another. Makes sense. Well, I mean, it goes without saying, I think hopefully most of our listeners probably have encountered some of your fiction, but if anyone is interested in any Star Trek
or Doctor Who, indeed, tie-in novels, I think Una's books are definitely a very good place to go to see some fantastic work. And I'm excited to hear that there might be some more in the Undefeated universe, but I hope that doesn't take you away entirely from Star Trek. And I'm sure for the Doctor Who fans out there as well, entirely from Doctor Who. Do you think you'll manage to continue kind of juggling all those balls as you go forward? Or are you kind of looking to reach kind of exit velocity and exist in your own universe from now on?
Well, we all have portfolio careers these days, don't we? So I'm happy to do, if people offer me work, I'm happy to do it. So no, I love doing books like this. It's enormous fun, and I enjoy. I really do enjoy it. It's sort of how my imagination works, and to be able to sort of then spin off into my own stuff is or to feel like I've got the confidence and the technical skill to be able to do that is a really good feeling as well. So yeah, just people keep buying the books, and that's the main thing.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Una. Before we go, do you want to let our listeners know where they can find you online or on social media, or if they want to get in touch?
Mostly I'm being grumpy on Twitter, and that's just at Una McCormack, so nothing complicated. So I'm trying not to get cross about politics, which is quite hard, but mostly I talk about books. I try and talk about books, what I'm reading, what I like reading, retweet sort of interesting stuff that people say. So that's usually where I am.
Fantastic. Well, talking about Mad Men and occasionally women in blue boxes is not the only thing we've been doing on Trek FM this week, surprisingly enough. So here's a listen to what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Ready Room.
Is this the supernatural Klingon episode? What is this going to be? And then it just turns out to go in and dig your own time crystals, State Park. I mean, it's like, okay.
Well, Larry, again, you go in there and there's a basket type thing there, and you put in your 10 quatloos and you get 60 minutes to dig your time crystal.
Darsex. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, the Klingons want Darsex, don't they?
Yeah.
And you go in, and actually, however many time crystals you can dig in 60 minutes, you get to keep. But the catch is they're time crystals. So 60 minutes to one person is only a minute to someone else.
Literary Treks.
We have the conversation between Pike and the Starfleet Admiral Terrell about the specifics of why they were kept out of the war. This is even before we're in a situation where they have no choice but to stay out of the war. They couldn't go back if they wanted to. By sort of setting up the milestones in the story for this is about when this is happening during season 1. That allows us to tell our own independent story within that, but yet also you'll always know where you are in the regular TV show.
Earl Grey.
That question about whether life exists, either yes it does, because enough time has elapsed and there's enough planets out there, or no it doesn't, because we are that race.
Oh.
that seeds life elsewhere in the universe at some point.
The other
in the
answer is it did, but they all destroyed themselves, But that's also kind of unlikely that you'd have lots of civilizations all doing the same thing and destroying themselves, I think. But
to the journey!
That's all I could think about with that one.
This is the Seinfeld in Space episode.
I keep waiting for Elaine to show up.
I'm trying to think of what Jerry Seinfeld would say in Jerry Seinfeld's tone of voice inside this episode. Can you do a good Jerry Seinfeld?
Oh, good grief, no. Not even close.
I'm trying to think how I would approach doing a Jerry Seinfeld impersonation. It's not coming to me. He's got that super high-pitched da-da-da-da-da kind of voice.
Well, that you did really well, the da-da-da-da-da. So, yeah, there you go.
Why don't they just warp out of here?
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC, and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended, all right.